copiar esa liga a la sesión en YouTube. Yo no tengo en estos momentos posibilidad, pero la tesis se llama La didáctica de la lógica desde la
Lo hacemos nosotros, ¿no?
de C. Spears, contribuciones para una relectura de la silogística. Entonces, creo que es importante que difundamos lo que hacemos las diferentes personas, porque esta plática estuvo planeada como una apología de la cooperación, hablando sobre lógicas diferentes, lógicas alternativas. Si me alcanzan a oír, voy a tratar de poner una presentación y me van a tener que disculpar porque voy a ir a Revientacaballo. Desgraciadamente tenemos como 20 minutos para cubrir muchísimo terreno, pero me interesa que me digan si se puede ver la pantalla compartida, que en este momento estoy tratando de mostrarles. ¿Alguien puede confirmarlo? Binuy, gracias. Muy bien. Entonces, rapidísimo, son pocas ideas, pero muchas diapositivas. Así que por ello es importante avanzar. La lógica trata de convencer. Tenemos cosas como deducción natural, tenemos la idea de evitar vicios argumentativos, hay la idea de la contabilidad de las dependencias, quienes hayan aprendido con esos métodos para llevar una honesta traza de dónde viene lo que uno dice, y eso ayuda a entender lo que dice cada línea. David, nada más para confirmar, ¿quieres que dé la plática en inglés? Por si tenemos algún invitado que no hable bien el español.
Sí.
Perdón, volvió a haber eco y no se te escuchó bien. ¿Lo puedes repetir?
A ver.
Hola, Raymundo, ¿me escuchas?
Ahí.
Hola, ¿me escuchas?
Sí, sí te escucho.
Bien, mira, sí es preferible, dado que habíamos propuesto hacerlo en inglés esta ocasión. De todos modos, vamos a tratar de, al final en las preguntas, pues vamos a tratar de...
Okay. So, we have like 10 minutes to show you everything.
Ya le pregunté a Lorenzo y quizá podamos terminar tu conferencia, digamos, 10:45 para tener 15 minutos más, ¿no?
Thank you. That's a big help. So I was saying that logic tries to argue, especially with the idea of tracking down logical dependencies. People who have used those kinds of natural deduction systems know that you want to tell where you got something from. Sorry, the recording stopped. And that helps you to be able to follow the defense of something, not only an accumulation of logical truths, but also the idea that you are deriving something. So the idea is that you have to be able to be honest about the assumptions that you make and to come clean. So there's a big intersection in the relation, inference, and argumentation, because logic has intrinsical argumentative elements. That doesn't mean that it is argumentation, of course. I need to use some stuff from Lilian Bermejo Luque. Not everything, because we don't have the time, but in a very important text, argumentation will be argumentation satisfying logical, dialectical, and rhetorical conditions. However, the other side of this coin is that argumentative normativity cannot conditions alone. So, you will have an intersection, not a subsumption, and you cannot reduce good argumentation to valid derivation. So you will have this idea that at the core of argumentation, there is going to be this relation of inference, but doesn't mean that it will be all you will have. There will be a mutual dependence and mutual utility of logic and argumentation, and that's what I try to exploit today. So you will need to be able to infer in order to derive, in order to argue. Without that, without the inferential step, you don't really have an argumentation. You just have a bunch of reasons. So she says in 2015, giving reason does not always amount to arguing. I defend a qualified interpretation of argumentation as reasons giving in an inferentialist conception of reasons that makes room for speaking of bad reasons. That is very important. And bad argumentation. So not everything goes. Argumentation must be characterized as a particular type of communicative reasons giving. And this communication is what distinguishes it from a mere deriving theorems all alone, you with yourself, not even talking to yourself, but just doing it in a monological way. The kind of reasons giving that counts as arguing is a communicative way of inviting. So it's something that we do to somebody else. We give the argumentation to somebody else as an invitation, the idea of Pinto, to reason. And she explains the relationship between argumentation as a communicative process and reasoning, a mental process, by considering that reasons as speech acts have as their mental counterpart the cognitive impulse that trigger acts of indirectly judging. You judge something because of something else. And she proposed in the book that I showed you first, a linguistic normative model for argumentation to characterize acts of arguing as second-order speech act complexes. Particularly, she provided an account of acts of arguing as speech acts consisting of a speech act of adducing and a speech act of concluding. So it's not enough to have the premises, it's not enough to have the conclusion, it's not enough to have the inference. You need to have a complex in which you are adducing the premises as basis for the conclusion for somebody else. Now, how can alternative logicians argue well for their position? Lilian continues, acts of arguing so characterized counts as attempts at showing a target claim to be correct. To the extent that they succeed in this, which means that the claim has been correctly qualified by a certain epistemic, moral, semantic conditions, and that the act of arguing is a good means for showing this, you have also the pragmatic conditions, they will be deemed good argumentation. That is, argumentation providing justification. And as you can see, a basic notion of good argumentation. If we are going to need something more complex, but this will be the core. In my view, persuading an adversary or audience is the most characteristic end that individuals pursue by giving reasons for their claims. Of course, there are other means to persuade. So don't do that at home. Try to persuade rationally, but in a legitimate way. I have proposed a conceptual argumentation as communication, but she says there are suggestions also, advices, threats, mere assertions, and all those things can be good enough to convince somebody. So here, like in the theory of Van Emeren, a protagonist and an antagonist, real or imagined, somebody you are trying to make them change their mind. So an argument will not be just one person, a logician, getting to a conclusion in private. It will have to be part of a discursive procedure through which two or more individuals who have different opinions try to come to an agreement. And he even says in 2010 that it is obvious that argumentation always arises as an answer or an anticipation of a difference of opinion. And I think by now, you know all these things from 30 years ago, that you have all these metaphors of argumentation as war, but argumentation is sometimes the best way to avoid war. So we can have other metaphors like negotiation, being cooperative, building something together, and we can have many metaphors for that. One metaphor that I like especially is one by Hensoyen in San Luis Potosí, who proposes the idea of colleagues. We can be colleagues building together. He's right, I believe, when he said that we are jumping unjustifiably from an epistemic situation, the disagreement, to a dialectical issue, which will be the adversariality. And he says there are different kinds of adversariality. For instance, being aggressive, or to play the devil's advocate, the role of an opponent, or to try to defeat the other person. As you can see, being aggressive, one that we're going to try to avoid. We don't want that kind of dialogue between alternative logicians. But it might be possible to have a fruitful role-playing, or even trying to defeat the other person's opinion. But to be in accordance, to agree, doesn't mean that you won't be aggressive, or vice versa. You can assume the role of an opponent to help to defend the shared opinions. Like right now, Kamala Harris has a person playing the role of Donald Trump to help her prepare better her arguments. Not because the other person believes in what Trump might say, but because that person is trying to cooperate to defend the ideas of Harris. The adversariality doesn't require that the speakers be in a genuine disagreement. And finally, you can just be mistaken, you can be confused, you might lose track of what's going on, and you might be trying to beat or refute somebody who has the same opinion that you have. Unfortunately, that is very common. So we argue sometimes to people who agree with us. This is a study 12 years ago in Indiana that showed that people tend to argue with people that have similar opinions. For instance, if you see the drawing B, hashtag GOP, it's a political discussion. The GOP is the Republican Party in the United States, but people tend to polarize. And they argue a lot among themselves, Republicans with Republicans, Democrats with Democrats. So the idea that you argue with people who disagree with you doesn't seem to be true, at least in the internet. Or you can use argumentation to try to find the foundations of something, like Frege, trying to find the foundations of arithmetic. But according to Hubert Marot, basically what you want in argumentation is to present something to somebody as a reason for something else. He calls it the minimal autonomous unit of argumentation. Premises and a conclusion which makes this presenting this something as a reason for this other thing. You can systematize the axiom, the structure of a theory. You can have a epidictic discourse to celebrate, to bond, to teach values that people might not disagree with. Still, it is important to have this argumentation for many reasons, for many uses, for many functions. So in the characterization of Luis Vega, an argumentation boils down to this intentional discursive interaction with two paradigmatic pretensions: to justify something and to induce the other person to do it, to consider it, to believe it. Notice that you don't have to have a discrepancy or try to change the opinion of anybody to be an argumentation in the sense of Luis. You can have mathematical arguments and still be able to say that you're arguing, even if it's monological. Before he's passing away, he wrote to me in 2020, every demonstration is a proof, and every proof is an argumentation. It's directed to somebody or done before somebody, including the limit case of oneself. Therefore, all demonstration is an argumentation. So what is the model of argumentation that we're going to use? The word-like model is very confusing. But because we can try to persuade even people who are initially indifferent, they're not antagonists, really. Or we might want to reinforce beliefs. So every model has its place. I have argued for more than a decade now. The word model, the disputing, the controversy, the fundamentation, the systematization, the epidictic model, all of them highlight different aspects. But we have to resist three temptations: to believe that there's no argumentation with a difference of opinion, to resist the temptation to believe that the difference of opinion leads unavoidably to a form of adversarial argumentation, and to believe that the archetypical kind of argumentation is going to be this aggressive, attacking and defending forensic style that Aristotle considered. And that's what he said, that sometimes you have to attack. So against whom do we have to argue? Against a lot of people normally, but not necessarily against anybody. Gersoyen says, we err if we consider ourselves opponents in argumentation. We are colleagues. You see, he's replacing the metaphor. In the search for knowledge, justification, rational action, and other epistemic goods. I like optimistic people. Now, supposedly logicians are all that. Logicians are people that are searching for knowledge, logical knowledge, justification. They don't say things just because. Rational action. They try to, since Parmenides, to pay attention to the goddess of reason. And they're looking for all these epistemic goods. But now we have paraconsistent, free, relevantist, erothetical, fuzzy logics, and new developments of old traditions like moral, intuitionistic, multi-valued, dialectic logics, etc. And some of them are offered as opponent. But historically, logic has always been for something. It has been designed for specific purposes. In psychology, or operatory, for law in deontics, for mathematics, intuitionistics, for physics, quantic, for linguists, for computation, etc., and of course for philosophers. But what is a logic? I have insisted for 40 years that we should not confuse the logical system, the calculus, be it syntaxis or formal semantics, with the higher level, the metalogical level, when you have completeness, correction, desirability, when you're talking about the properties of the system, or what is sometimes what people have in mind when they talk about alternative rival logics, like the relation of the calculus to language, to thought, or to reality. So if logic is this vector of different things, where does rivalry or complementarity, extensionality are located? And surprisingly, you're going to make this distinction about the logical operation of conditional material, the metalogical operation of the derivability, and the semantic notion of consequence. Again, if your metalogic is formal, this consequence might be also syntactical, but it can be a richer notion that is philosophical. Then the extensions will be basically saying classical logic is incomplete, we want to help. And that's the way that normally logicians present fuzzy, deontic, epistemic, erothetic, linear, moral, non-monotonic, temporal, etc. Or classical logic is wrong, it has to be replaced. Quantic, intuitionistic, dialectic, free, paraconsistent, multi-value, relevant, sometimes are presented that way. So you get a rival when you disagree with classical logic, think that your proposal is incompatible, and you try to replace. So is rivalry the same as divergence? It's simply that you have another calculus with other theorems, with other axioms. Is complementarity just that you have extra? No, neither thing. Because extension and rivalry are at the higher level, not at the level of theorems or axioms, which is the level of the calculus, but at the level higher up of the philosophy of logic. As Quine will say, it is a question rather of outright rejection of part of our logic as not true at all. notice that it is not a sufficient cause either, because you will always reinterpret and say, yes, I can have that calculus, I just reading it differently. And in the words of Priest, this is not perhaps surprising, since rivalry is defined in terms of the pragmatic notion of use. Where do you want to use it? Deviance is a purely formal consideration about the terrainhood of certain strings of symbols, etc. So don't mistake those different levels. And Oragen, the great Argentinian teacher we had in Mexico, used to distinguish between proper extensions, semantical, and improper, which are just syntactical variations. And those are trivial. Why is moral logic not trivial? Because it's not only giving me another symbol or another primitive notion, it gives me one that I cannot recover through the primitive notions of classical logic. So it's more than a merely syntactic extension. And Newton da Costa, the great Brazilian logician that recently died, wrote, if the axioms and rules governing negation, amongst other logical laws, are changed to originate a paraconsistent logic, will the resulting negation still be a real negation? Well, it's like asking if in non-Euclidean geometry you still have lines. Da Costa's answer is yes, it is a negation, even if it's not the classical negation, but it's in the family. Different rules can refer to different connectors. So Boschbar might deny the principle of excluded middle, but it is not being negated for classical negation. So it looks like, as a metatheorical phenomenon, what we are asking about is the use of logic. Is classical negation a good translation of negation as used in these areas, sciences, or when sciences are not trivial but inconsistent still? And Putnam insisted that there is a core meaning in the logical connectives that remains unaltered even when we deny excluded middle. So you can discuss which one is a better translation. Any formal test, said, needs to be supplemented by considerations of meaning. After all, we can have different meanings in different theories and still have a meaningful discussion. So if classical logics try to handle something beyond its capacities, it is justified for you to be a rival. But if it starts moderating the pretensions, then we can have just a complementarity. We can dance together. We don't need to be enemies. We can support each other. So to be able to live with the Lukashevic's logics for future contingents, or the paradoxes of Boschbar, or the indecidability of Kleene, or the nonsense of Halden, or the very true gaps of Woodruff, or the presuppositions of Van Frazen, we just have to accept logic. Classical logic presupposes bivalence. It's not a secret. Every good classical logicians know that. And no well-educated classical logician ever pretend that classical logic would apply beyond that area. Now, this seems to be like saying, well, classical logic applies wherever classical logic applies. But, and Lorenzo Peña said, if I assert the principle of excluded middle, I'm not saying that it applies to whatever it applies to, but that it applies to anything, whatever. So we're going to have to be modest, humble, honest, realistic classical logicians. And it's very common, as the saying goes, that when they give you a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So it's very common that classical logicians will forget that lesson. So rivals can be the alternative logics can be our help to remind ourselves how to be more precise about what we're saying. Classical logic is designed for very precise languages, for non-empty domains, for terms without vagueness, with references, with objects, denotations. If you don't have that, get another logic. So don't create a conflict where none should be. It's only when you have these exaggerated claims that you can start talking about, well, which one is the true logic? Which one is the correct one? If you mean the logic that reflects how people think, none. Maybe fortunately, no good logic worth considering will be able to model what this guy is doing in that picture. Maybe what logic adapts to the form in which people should think. And the proposal is all of them within their realm, within their domain of discourse. If bivalence holds, then Lukashevic's tree collapses in classical. Woodrow has the limited assertion. Zad has, of course, you can have excluded middle in certain domains when you have complete being in the set or outside of the set. And that is the way that the Journal of Non-Classical Logics in the first issue talk about intuitionist logics as complementary for constructivist mathematics. Obviously, Da Costa said, a logic cannot be classed in an absolute fashion as complementary or alternative. All of the logics can be viewed as formalizing a different notion, thus being complementary. He was trying to be very friendly. He was very friendly. The fact that adversariality is not an essential component is compatible with being an appropriate component in many situations. So, when it is okay for alternative logics to be adversarial, it is okay to attack as long as we believe the other side is wrong. But it is not enough to believe the other side is saying something different. And it is never okay to be hostile or aggressive. That kind of adversariality should be banned. Instead, we should privilege cooperation in as many areas and at as many levels as we can. For Gauvier, adversariality could be eliminated even if it was appropriate in some contexts. In logic as in life, I believe, it is preferable to cooperate even when we have incompatible interests and even incompatible short-term and long-term goals in the service of those interests. And I believe, call me optimistic also, that we will not have, totally incompatible interests with other logicians. So, what is argumentative adversary in alternative logics? It can mean many things. Logical, inconsistent premises, dialectical, engaging, refuting, or undermining, rhetorical, trying to reduce the degree of acceptance. But I want to concentrate on adversarial behavior, not what you believe or look for, but what you do. Adversary is as adversary does, because it's a whole family of notions, but we want one that will allow people with the same interests to act adversarially and people with opposite interests to cooperate. We don't want to, in principle, exclude that. We don't want existence of cooperativity without cooperation. In my sense of the word, you are an adversary if and only if you behave like one. Remember? You might think that you are an adversary, but you might be unwittingly collaborating. You might want to collaborate, but you might inadvertently adding obstacles. You can be wrong about your role, even if you are correct about what are your goals. So let's eschew top intentions. Let's leave it aside for the moment. Let's concentrate on the behavioral conditions for display of hostility or for having as a priority the defeat of the other agent. A behavior characterized by attack, aggression, violence, an antagonistic behavior that will be called warlike, in Greek, polemic, polemos, because after all, Ares was the Greek goddess of strife and discord. If there is no attack, there is no adversariality. In this sense of aggressive attack, not a good-natured attack. And it has to be contextually appropriate because argumentative exchanges are dynamic processes. During the same kind of argumentation, there might be moments when cooperation is called for and other moments when adversariality is appropriate. And you might remember the famous tit for tat program of Axelrod. First cooperate, but if the other person defects, answer in kind. Curiously enough, his PhD thesis in '69 was conflict of interest. Something like Katerina Dutil-Novaes, this kind of adversariality, because he was thinking about politics. But 12 years later, in '81, in the article that he wrote with Hamilton, The Evolution of Cooperation, which gave rise to that beautiful book a couple of years later, he focuses on what the agents do. Answer in kind to what the other person does, no matter what intentions were involved. So my hunch is that adversarial argumentation amongst alternative logics, including yes against classical logic, is appropriate in many cases. But in most situations, it will be more productive to cooperate in the outlining of areas of application. As Bermejo has emphasized, many attempts at finding norms for argumentation have tried to find them within an instrumentalist perspective, as an instrument for the persuasion of a universal audience, the rational persuasion, the resolution of a difference of opinion, or the obtention of justified beliefs. But the primary function of argumentation, the one that gives meaning and sense to the whole endeavor of looking for argumentation norms, is the function as a tool to provide a good epistemic footing. That is, a good justification. If not, any audience will do, or any persuasion, or any resolution, but only those governed by rationality constraints, then the core of admissible justifications is epistemic. We are not saying that the justificatory function is the one true function of argumentation. A core function has little to do with the psychological reality of our purposes. The fact that internal combustion engine presupposes gas explosions is still today, in a few years, they want to change that. That's little to convince us that the function of Formula One racing is to produce gas explosions. A constitutive function is just one necessary to fulfill all the other ones. So, an intuitionist, relevantist, or dialectic logicians can be cooperative or be adversarial towards classical logicians depending on what she does. If she helps develop the classical meta theory, she's being cooperative. If she attacks the legitimacy of classical inference, she's adversarial. And she may do both at the same time because they are not at the same level, remember? Or they are at the same level, but not about the same issue, remember? Cooperation has been proved over and over again to be more efficient, and we can cooperate with the higher aims of education while being adversarial to their faulty theories of the students. That means that Anderson and Belknap cooperate at the level of philosophy of logic as much as C.I. Lewis, provided we recognize the material conditional is a poor substitute for entailment. And I think we can all agree with that by now. According to Dutil, specific instances of argumentation are and should be adversarial or cooperative to different degrees. What determines whether an argumentative situation should be primarily adversarial or primarily cooperative are contextual features and background conditions external to the argumentative situation itself, in particular the extent to which the parties involved had prior conflicting or else convergent interests. And she gives an example of adversariality, the pursuit of incompatible interests. But there are other kinds of adversaries. She knows that. It is not a definition. And look, with a little imagination, you can produce many examples when there is such a pursuit without adversariality and vice versa. It is often the case that two people help each other without realizing they have incompatible interests, or even after they have realized it. Also, it is common to be adversaries even when the interests are orthogonal or even shared. So beware, an adversary might destroy us by granting our desires. Sometimes our immediate interests go against our higher interests. So, is that collaboration or is it adversariality? Conflict of interest does not necessarily translate into argumentative conflict. So if you realize your interests are advanced by losing the argumentation, then your very interests might lead you to try and help your adversary, who has incompatible interests, to win the argument. After all, personal interests have no import from the logical or dialectical points of view. Remember, no matter what your subjective aims are, you are still bound by the laws of procedure and the laws of logic. An alternative logic is a rival only when it attacks the other one at the level of the calculus, the formal meta-logic, or the philosophy of logic. That is the important one. Such attacks are appropriate to press an opposing case, but not necessary to develop the system below the level of philosophical disputes about suitability for an intended domain of application. So the moral of the story, finally, never be heuristically adversarial. Resist the temptation, especially young alternative logicians. If your opinions are incompatible, be collaboratively adversarial. That will give you a better old age. Have the courtesy of looking for areas of application of other logics, not only yours. And have communication. Even better. Communication is the basic, remember, Bermejo Luque? But also have commerce, exchange goods. And I want to finish with a great poet that I admire very much, Ezra Pound, who wrote, "I make truce with you, Walt Whitman. I have detested you long enough. I come to you as a grown child who has had a pig-headed father. I am old enough now to make friends. It was you that broke the new rule. Now is a time for carving. We have one sap and one root. Let there be commerce between us." Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot of Raymundo. So we have more or less 10 minutes, 12 minutes for questions and answers. So please be brief about people here in the auditory or in YouTube channel. So anyone has a question? Questions, comments, rivality, adversariality. No, something like that. Okay, maybe.
Aquí se puede hablar, sí. Hello, Raymundo. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, I hear you.
Well, I think your talk is beautiful. You achieve mixed logic and theory of argumentation very well. I think I want to ask you if you could talk about more because I think it's kernel of your position at the three levels or dimensions of logic, metalogic, calculus, and philosophy of logic, because I think that perspective is very promised in the studies in combinations of logics or philosophy of non-classical logics.
Let me see if I understand you. I can oppose you by saying you made a mistake, you made an error in your derivation. That theorem doesn't follow, this rule was not properly applied or something like that. That would be adversariality at the level of the calculus. I would say your use of the calculus didn't follow the rules, for instance. But I can also tell you, you think that there's a proof for Fermat's theorem, but you're wrong. The one that is out in published has is not acceptable, and even further, that proposition is undecidable. There can be no proof or disproof of it. Okay, now I'm talking about the system. I'm at a meta level. Or I can be saying, look, you want to translate the negation of a material conditional as from the antecedent, the consequent much better. From the truth of the material conditional, you want to have the truth of the deducibility. If it doesn't happen A without B, then from A, B follows. So that's something that I can tell you that is an improper use because deducibility is not a good translation of the material conditional, even if the material conditional is a good translation of deducibility, because a translation can legitimately sometimes lose information. But the devil is when you add information, when you put words into somebody's mouth, when you say something that they didn't say. That's a bad translation. Not when you don't say everything they said, but when you say more than they said, something that they didn't say or imply. So you have these three different levels of antagonism, and alternative logics can be antagonistic properly only at the third level, only at the level of the philosophy of logics. But even then, the adversariality can be tempered by cooperation. So it's not the adversariality of the heuristic tradition of the fight of the warlike metaphors, it's a adversariality that has room for colleagues, for collaboration, and I can profit from you calling to my attention the shortcomings of my theory. Is that what you are proposing, David?
Yes, very well. Thank you for the illustration. Si alguien más quiere hacer alguna pregunta, puede hacerlo en español aquí en Instagram.
Sí. So we have Professor Jesus Castro.
Hello, Raymundo. Okay. You say let us demand that the rival system can replace the LC rival is not a cause of divergence, okay? So about that point, two very simple points about this case. Whether rival or complementary systems complement a gaps. What does complement mean in this case? This is my first point. And my second point is what happened to the status of the logicality of each of them when you are talking about the complement between them.
Yeah, that's a very good question. If I understood, is pointing to the fact that we don't have a complete system of logic. There has never been one. We don't have it yet. Hopefully someday, but there are discussions about even the possibility. The notion of correct inference is a very powerful notion, and we can handle it normally in very restricted domains, certain kinds of languages, certain kinds of facts, and we leave out a lot. So somebody can come and say, I notice some logical relations that your system does not capture. I don't want to call it only extension, because sometimes you're not extending, you're actually doing something different that might have some intersection or even not be something completely separate. But it still is another piece of the puzzle. The jigsaw puzzle has many pieces, some overlap, but some might not. So that's what I think of that as complementary. And what is sometimes seen as a rival system might be just something that covers a different area. True rivalry is when you cannot do that. When you are really making a claim that is incompatible with other claims. And that means that you are talking about the same.
Yes.
There's no other way to be incompatible.
Okay.
So there can be no change of meaning, no using the conditional in a different way. It has to be talking about the same, and then somebody's right and somebody's wrong. And either way, you can be helping me by bringing up these objections and these alternatives. Am I understanding well? What was the comment?
Yes. The complementary is about the scientific problem or about the your notion of logic.
Sorry, was that a question? Is the
Yeah.
complementary about?
What is the motivations about the complementary between each logic is about when you're talking about the problems in science, for example. But one thing is that way, and another thing is when you are talking about one conception of logic. Without applications.
Yes, because you can have two logicians who are rivals to each other, sharing the same notion of logic, or logicality.
Yeah.
You seem to be pointing to something that is much deeper, which is when you're not even talking about the same idea of logicality.
Mm-hmm.
When I say, look, I can have deontic logics talking about legitimacy values. And people said, oh, wait a moment, logic is about preservation of truth. You're talking about preservation of legitimacy of mandates or orders. So you're talking about something that is no longer logic. And I remember a beautiful answer by Héctor Neri Castañeda,
Yes.
who said, don't call it logic, call it is logic. So let's not fight about names. Let's say under the roof of the house of logic, there can be many rooms. There can be many different ways to develop. And I don't want to call what I'm doing logic. At least try to find out where what I'm doing can be useful for something, can be applied, can be incorporated into a bigger tent that maybe is not called logic, maybe is the theory of inference or the theory of the right way of thinking, or don't call it logic if you don't want. Don't be sidetracked by the fact that your goals are different.
Okay.
You're trying to ascertain the logical structure of different things.
Okay.
Great. Your goals are different. You can still work together.
Mhm.
You don't have to go to the same place to help each other advance. That is the optimistic take on this. And that's why the emphasis on complementarity.
Okay.
Because I think it's, in the long run, more fruitful for logicians to profit from the crazy things that other logicians do.
Okay.
Would you agree with that?
Yes. Great. Thank you very much, Raymundo.
Oh, thank you. That's a beautiful question there.
Yes. We have one more question, so please, Alan.
Hello, Raymundo. Thank you so much for your talk. I just wondering, what is the most important reason for defending the idea of science progress? How do you know that's there? How do we know that's there is science progress is now, and it's a study of logic degrees?
If I understand your question, Alan, is how do I know there's progress in science?
Yes.
Logic. In logic, we have proofs. There was things that we ignore, and we have a date. We know exactly when and who found the answer. And better yet, we not only have an answer, we have a proof that the answer is right. So that's, for me, that's a very clear example of progress, going from ignorance to knowledge. So people who says, we're always discussing the same things, there's no advance, nothing new, truth is never achieved, etc. Well, it's people who didn't have a good course in logic. Because in logic, again, you not only find facts, logical facts, you also find demonstrations of those facts. And that's the difference between having more beliefs and having more knowledge. The fact that you have a good justification for it. I think that in that respect, Lilian Bermejo Luque is right. Justification is the core. And that is what will tell you that you have progress in science. Is your science better justified than before? Has a firmer base? Maybe it still has mistakes and errors, but does it have a better justification? Or it still has very weak, flimsy justifications, buttressing the whole edifice, the whole building? It is the methodological question that can show you that there's progress in science, not the beliefs, not the facts found, not the more data, but how we get the data and how we make sure that we're not fooling ourselves. The precautions that now we have not to fool ourselves is what gives us progress in science and not only development of culture. So methodology, we have better methodology than ever before. This is the golden age of scientific progress. We're very fortunate.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan.
So thank you a lot, Raymundo Morado. So we first the first part of this day. So please get your hands. And then we have now we can change the camera and microphone to the auditory. So we
¿En Zoom me escucharán?
Me parece que sí. A ver, otra vez.
A ver, no sé si me escuchan ahí en Zoom. Si alguien puede poner en el chat si me escucha o no. A ver si alguien ahí me escucha en Zoom. Ahí pongan en el chat si me escuchan o no.
Aquí sí se escucha. Mira.
Ah, sí, ya, Raimundo me hizo la señal. Muchas gracias. Ok. Interesante, interesante.
Sí, pero habría que hablar fuerte, ¿no?
Sí, así de que y vamos.
So there is not the
No, there's no change. Check.
we can use micrograph because it is total. It is office total.
So, yes, Discoverability. Now your microphone, and if you want. So we are ready.
Okay, we are ready. Then, bien, ¿estás listo? Are you ready? Bueno, la segunda parte de este día de nuestras jornadas de lógicas no clásicas consiste, como ya es la propuesta de Principhia para esta clase de jornadas, de un seminario. El seminario en esta ocasión está a cargo del doctor Lorenzo Magnani y es en el sentido de que podamos los que habíamos enviado con anticipación y la exposición que el doctor Magnani nos trae el día de hoy. En esta ocasión el texto es sobre abducción, es el primero de los textos, y el otro, el jueves, está vinculado con la noción de violencia. Well, we are very, very grateful with Dr. Lorenzo Magnani. He will be in charge of the seminar, and this seminar is about the first paper we was sent in the last week, and in this format, Principhia wants to enrich the discussion and the reflection about the ideas of Dr. Lorenzo Magnani. We are very happy to have Dr. Lorenzo Magnani here. He is a full professor in the University of Pavia, and we know Lorenzo Magnani because he designed a very famous model of abduction, un modelo muy famoso de abduction, que it is very interesting, has a way to connect context with the abduction and other things attributed to the notion of abduction. Thank you, Lorenzo.
Is this microphone necessary for some registration reasons, or may I speak without the microphone? Because maybe you are able to listen to me.
Maybe you are right, the record.
Okay, so it is better to use the microphone. Yeah.
Yes.
I guessed. And so, this is a guess, and you know that abduction is related to the guesses. I hope that you will be able to understand my English. my English is the English spoken by an Italian, so it is easier, I think, for you than in case of native speakers. Okay, so thank you, of course, to David Gaetan, to the other organizers. I am happy to be here in Mexico City. I already visited Mexico City in 2005, so about 20 years ago, and I was invited by Abduction. Okay. So, as you can see, the title of my presentation is Discoverability in the perspective of the eco-cognitive model of abduction. And the subtitle is The Centrality of Eco-Cognitive Situatedness. Weird words, but soon explained. Discoverability. Why discoverability? Because people always speak about discovery, creativity, invention, but there is another problem. The problem is, in the case, for instance, of a human being, to be in a situation in which discover, creativity, invention is favored. Okay. And consider we will have on Wednesday also another presentation that is related to a complete different topic. And anyway, David wanted to have this topic about violence and so on in this seminar that is related to the problem of there is also the fact that discoverability in our current situation in the Western world is also in some cases jeopardized in the case of science, okay? Some fields of science, because mainly of an excess of commercialization, are in a bad situation from the point of view of discoverability. Not only my opinion, also the opinion of other researchers. So, discoverability in the perspective of eco-cognitive model of abduction. What is the meaning of eco-cognitive model? Eco doesn't refer to the green era that is so favored in European Union. European Union is a hyper green. It is not related to the green era, but to the environment in which cognition happens. In this case, cognition, imagine that, okay. In this case, the emphasis is, of course, related to the fact that abduction happens and can be better described with if we refer to some environmental aspects. Okay, so in the subtitle there is also, I also emphasized the fact that the eco-cognitive situatedness in abductive reasoning is extremely important. As you can imagine, you are many logicians. In the case of logical models, also logical models of abduction, because there are many logical models of abduction. The eco-cognitive situatedness is not so important because of the fact that eco-cognitive of the fact that logical systems are very abstract and idealized. Okay, so there is a first slide, but that is not present. Okay, what happens?
No, porque está allá. Okay. Some workers, perhaps. Fantástica. Si alcanzará. concentrar. La otra computadora sí se desconectó, ¿verdad?
A ver si quieres otra vez intento.
Sí.
Okay, I'm not able also to visualize, but you know that the Italians use the hands. What do you think? Can we go ahead, or do you prefer to see the slides? Because there is also the English that is written English in the case of the slides.
Ajá. A ver, pásame el HDMI.
Me
tantito.
parece que ya.
Sí, a ver.
Permíteme.
¿Qué estás intentando ver?
Aquí. Sí, pero denme un segundo. Denme un segundo.
Pásame el HDMI, a ver si
Es que, a ver, espérame. A ver, inténtalo tú.
Ahí va. Y vamos a ponerlo hacia atrás. Sí. Perfecto. Okay, so you introduce maybe the clicker, or you can do
I
it
can
here.
use this. I think it works.
Yes.
Yes, it works. Look, you have to eliminate this.
Yes.
object. This is a zoom object, extra object. An extra entity. Okay, so my presentation will be divided in four parts. The first one is more logical, or at least
Okay.
more in various parts. The first part is mainly related to the problem of fallacies, okay? Because you know that in the light of classical logic, adaptive cognition, adaptive reasoning is the fallacy of affirming the consequent, okay? But anyway, when I use the word inference, I am in this case a follower of Charles Sanders Peirce. Peirce stated that all thinking is in science, and science can be icons, indices, or symbols. Moreover, all inference is a form of sign activity. You know that Peirce invented the semiotics, not only a contributor of logic, and semiotics, Peircean semiotics sees cognition as a work of icons, indices, symbols. So not only symbols, not only words, okay? And you all know that you can reason also using images, okay? Do you agree? So, well, the word sign includes feeling, image, conception, and other representation. You know that in this case, also a feeling is considered by Peirce a kind of cognition, so an emotion, for instance, as something related to a cognition. And the Kantian words or synthetic force of cognition, that is, a considerable part of the thinking activity is model-based. Well, model in this case is that you are not using, you are not referring only to words, okay, or symbols, but for instance, to diagrams, images, thought experiments, something that is a bit distant from logic in this case, but not so distant, because you know that there are also the so-called heterogeneous logics, in which you can use also small diagrams, and so you can use not only symbols as in the mainstream tradition of logic. Okay, so of course, model-based reasoning acquires its peculiar creative relevance when embedded in adaptive reason processes. Why? Imagine scientific abductions. When you have to make abductions related to discover something new in science, discovery is important. Scientists always use models, and not only physicists, biologists, but also mathematicians use models. And so models are important in adaptive reasoning. Okay. Totally stopped. So, two main characterization of abduction, very general. Reasoning to hypothesis, you all know. Sentential means that you can make abductions using microphone. You can make abduction. I have too many elements to manage. Okay, so yes, you have to. I don't like the subject. You have to. You can make abduction using words. Okay, are you able to make abduction using words? Of course. Because if I ask you something about your events of yesterday, you have to make a hypothesis, you can use it. But also models. This is an example. This is an interesting model used by Nikolai Ivanovich Lobachevsky, and you can see is a Euclidean model, because it is a diagram, so it is not related to words. There are some symbols inside, but it is a diagram. And this is an important Euclidean diagram, because with this diagram, Lobachevsky was able to explain the consistency of a non-Euclidean geometry. Because in this diagram, there are also non-Euclidean aspects. This is an example of creative abduction, okay? Made not only with symbols and words, because you know, in a proof, in a mathematical proof, there are also words of the natural language, symbols, but in the case of Lobachevsky, diagrams. Okay, you know that in ancient geometry, diagrams were very important. And they are still important at the beginning of 19th century, because these revolutionary changes, conceptual changes in mathematics, took advantage of Euclidean diagrams. Okay. Some example of model-based cognition. So you are almost all logicians. In this case, I am referring to ways of reasoning. that are a bit far from logic. But I already told you that in the heterogeneous logics, you can insert small models. Okay. Simulative reasoning, for instance, you have some neurons, and you want to study the behavior of some neurons, and you can build a computational model. This is a simulation. Analogy is a typical example of a model. Visual iconic reasoning, spatial thinking, thought experiment. Remember that the birth of modern science, thanks to Galileo Galilei, was due to a thought experiment, because Galileo invented the thought experiment about the falling bodies, a thought experiment that was able to destroy the Aristotelian perspective on falling bodies. Perception is a model-based cognition, of course. Sense activity, visual imagery. Are you able to build imageries? Okay. Are you able to depict in your mind a letter U? Are you able to move the letter U of 180 degrees? What is the letter that you realize? N. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And also in deductive reasoning. Okay. For instance, do you know the best method of semantic tableau? Of course. Girard's geometry of proofs. Models are very important because when you make a proof, not only in logic, but also in mathematics, usually you write the proof, okay? And then you see the proof written, not only the one that you have in your mind. Not only you can learn new things from the written proof, okay? And in this case, the proof is maybe full of symbols, okay? But also presents a shape. And depending on the shape of the proof, you can get more ideas. In this case, we come back in this case to the eco-cognitive aspect. When you write a proof or a hypothesis of a proof, and you learn something to see the proof written, you are using the environment because you have something external, written proof, that is able to suggest to you something that you could not be able to discover with the only use of the internal representations, okay? In this case, a written proof, of course, in a sheet of paper, but maybe also in a computer, okay? Also, emotion is a kind of cognition in the Persian point of view. And you can also make abduction thanks to emotion. Charles Sanders Peirce was convinced that emotion could be a kind of abduction, okay? For instance, if you see a person and you experience a negative emotion, this is a kind of hypothesis about that person, okay? That is not made by words, it is not a logical hypothesis, it is not made by models, but just thanks to an emotional aspect. Okay, let's go ahead. Okay, this is an example of analogical reasoning. Watson and Crick, when invented the DNA and RNA, they have an analogy that derived to them from seeing two snakes. Okay, And so this was good for discovering the DNA in the case of water. Good. Let's go ahead. This is obviously a famous very rudimentary, but it is a model. Okay. In this case, it is good for didactical reasons, for instance, not for discovering something new, but didactical reasons. Okay, so the AC model of abduction, cool down and fill up problems, consistency, minimality, plausibility, and relevance are emphasized in the received view. I think that you are studying non-monotonic logic, you encountered the important role in adaptive reasoning, consistency, minimality, plausibility, relevance. Okay, we will see that these are not the only criteria that we have to respect to make abductions, because of the fact that there are some situations in which to make abductions is favored, for instance, is favored by implausibility, unrelevance, and something that can be usually considered negative from the rational point of view. Okay, so I'm making an unrelevant abduction, an implausible abduction, but unfortunately is a good abduction too. Okay, so this we have to remember this aspect of abduction that is related to remember the subtitle, the centrality of eco-cognitive situatedness. Okay, if you are a physician, for instance, if you have to make a diagnosis, so to make a selective, what I call a selective abduction, you have to respect something related to plausibility. Okay. If a scientist, you can also imagine a hypothesis that's very, very plausible, unrelevant, and can be a good hypothesis. Is actually ignorance preserving? This is related to the fact that abduction is based on incomplete information, and so when you make a hypothesis, you do not eliminate the ignorance. You can just diminish your ignorance about the world. Abductive virtus vindicate. How does abduction supply knowledge? The empirical test is not the only way of comparing truth to hypothesis knowledge content. You know that the received view, one of the standard views of abduction is that it's important to have in abductive reasoning also the empirical phase that Peirce unfortunately called it induction. It's not a good word in this case. So you make an hypothesis and then you derive consequences deductively, and you can see empirically if the abductive hypothesis is confirmed. Okay, this is not the only kind of abduction, because there are abductions that do not carry you to a correct hypothesis without empirical test. And here there are two examples: the epistemology of eventually inert knowledge enhancing. An example is perception, because you perceive and immediately what you perceive is okay. Okay, it was observed by Charles Sanders Peirce. And so you do not need to confirm your perception. Usually, with the exception of some particular cases in the dark and so on, perception already furnishes to you what has to be considered good. but not only, also guessing conventions in science. Henri Poincaré, that spoke about conventions, was aware of the fact that conventions do not lead to empirical tests, empirical confirmation. But not only abduction and strategic plausibility, instrumental abduction, Newton action at distance is another example of an inert, evidentially inert knowledge enhancing abduction. Do you remember the concept, the Newtonian concept of action at distance? Okay, it is possible to empirically verify this hypothesis because it is something metaphysical derived from the studies of Newton of alchemy. Okay, but it is good, it is important in Newtonian physics because you can't have Newtonian physics without the action at this distance. Okay, so this was to say, to explain the fact that in abduction, not necessarily you need, not necessarily you have to consider abduction always related to the empirical test, the empirical confirmation. Okay, this is my book on abductive cognition of 2009, in which all these aspects are explained. Okay. What is manipulative abduction? Okay, this is the example of before. Manipulative abduction is referred to the problem of the environment, eco-cognitive aspects. Okay. I am not able, for instance, to make a hypothesis about the tissue of your jacket. Okay. This was true, especially 30 years ago. Now are all synthetic, so it is easier to make a hypothesis about the tissues. But imagine these tissues of wood, of soy, and so on. In that case, you have to touch the tissue. And so you have to get not only the visual sensation, but also a tactile sensation. But to get the tactile sensation, you have to move your body. You have to cognitively exploit the environment, okay? And so you have to move your body, you have to use your hand, and you have to touch the tissue. In that case, you have received more information and you can guess a hypothesis. There is a book that was written by an epistemologist of the United Kingdom called Wooding that was related on the book to the role of what I call manipulative abduction in the history of science, in which some scientists, for instance, Maxwell, Ampere, they always exploited the environment. For instance, making complicated artifacts. Ampere made complicated artifacts that were able for some reasons, but Ampere was not aware of the target of those artifacts. It was something random, but thanks to the manipulation of those artifacts, he was able to make and to produce some important hypotheses. So this is manipulative abduction. Also, this dam was written outside in a sheet of paper. So it was necessary an exploitation of the environment to perform your cognitive activity. You know that in current cognitive science, there is a tradition that is called 4 or triple EI tradition, in which cognition is seen as distributed in the environment, embodied, because also the body is related to this, to cognition, embedded, and there is also the so-called extended mind that was promoted by Clark, that is related to the fact that Clark said cognition needs the extension of the mind in the environment. This is an example, because Lobachevsky had to draw the diagrams externally and to see the diagrams externally to make some other symbolic proofs related to the discovery of non-Euclidean geometry. Okay. Some questions, some necessity of more explanation.
Well, I just wanted to know the book by which book is it?
The book, I don't remember the
All right.
this moment. If you send me an email, I will. I don't remember. It was a Springer book anyway. I don't remember. I wanted to say the title, but I didn't remember. That was about. He called construals those artifacts. Okay. Other questions, clarification. Okay.
So the diagram is about a representation of manipulative abduction, or it's about thinking through doing manipulative abduction?
Okay, thinking through doing is another way of explaining manipulative abduction. Okay, but thinking through doing is more general, because manipulative abduction is related to making hypotheses. Thinking through doing, you can also produce some bullshit. You can also produce adversarial thinking, like in previous presentation, adopting also something physical, okay? But in the case of manipulative abduction, of course, you are related to a kind of thinking through doing, but related to making hypotheses. Okay.
Sorry, and that is when you have a propositional component. You have one list to make definitions along the lines.
No, excuse me, I did not understand. Repeat the question, please.
Yeah, that image, the graphic, have propositional content about the manipulative abductions. You have one list that you use to interpret, to make the interpretation about the scheme.
One list.
So that is a model.
Okay.
That picture is a model.
Oh, yes, of course, absolutely. Yes, it is a model that is related to manipulative abduction. Not only manipulative abduction is always related to models in the case that you manipulate external models. Because also a diagram is a model, okay? So I agree with your question, because it is important to notice these aspects. A diagram is a model, but also an artifact is a kind of model. And so of the fallacies, way of make the deceptive reason. Okay, do you agree? And I agree with this image. Imagine the politicians, they use fallacies of any kind to be rhetorically and persuasive. Okay. Also in adversarial reasoning, fallacies dominate in the previous presentation. Okay, so as you know, asti generalization and adversarial are considered inductively weak inferences, while affirming the consequent abduction is a deductible invalid inference. There are some distinctions in the studies of fallacy. ASCII generalization is a generalization based on one or two examples, okay? For instance, all women are bad drivers, okay? It is also bad from the moral point of view, and it is not true. Because in reality, women make less accidents than men. Okay, so nevertheless, when they are used by actuarism and being like us would say, when that is in an ecological and not merely logical, ideal and abstract way, that fallacies are depicted thanks to this ideal and abstract level, okay, they are no longer necessarily fallacies because they work in an eco-cognitive environment to some targets. Not only remember that the fallacies can be also can carry you to a true conclusion, because there is this is called by Brandon material validity. No? Material validity is when a fallacy is true. Okay. So from the eco-cognitive point of view, fallacies are very important. And they are not necessarily fallacies, because if I use the fallacies to convince a person to get a new interesting work, and I was able to have success in this, so the fallacy was good. It was not a fallacy because it was something good, something needed. Also, ASCII generalization in terms of mouses is also a tool for survival, because when one mouse encounters a poisoned food, one example, there is inductive generalization communicated to the other mouses, and this favors to save their lives. So in an eco-cognitive perspective, fallacies are no more fallacies in many cases. They maintain their status as fallacies with respect to ideal and abstract idealization, usually made by logic. Traditionally, fallacy has considered this text that appears to be error, attractive, and seductive, but also universal as human. Okay. What is our concern? Our concern is to remember that fallacy, that abduction is a kind of fallacy in the light of classical logic. Of course, here we are in a seminar on non-classical logics, so we invented also exactly non-classical logic to deal with reasonings that are not contemplated by classical logic, such as abduction. As you know, that abduction is a very interdisciplinary concept, because you can see abduction building logical models, for instance, non-monotonic logic and other logics. You can see abduction from the philosophical point of view, from the psychological point of view, and from the computational point of view, because there is also the problem of these computers. Now is the era of artificial intelligence that are able to make good abductions in many fields. Okay, not only medical diagnosis, but also playing games and so on. So abduction is a very interdisciplinary word. Okay, let's go ahead. Okay, traditional fallacies such as ad hominem are cognitive mistakes and strategic successes, because you all agree that without abductive cognition, we human beings will be very poor. We make hypotheses many times in a day, maybe less ad hominem, but abduction surely is a very widespread way of reasoning on the part of human beings. Okay. Surely more than modus ponens, or modus ponens, okay. Or ex falso sequitur quod. Maybe the X factor sector property is a classical rule that is always used in this. Because when you make a fast that you can derive what you want, and so it is good in many eco-cognitive settings. Okay. So rather that in the case of the gang of 18 traditional fallacy, there is fallacy. I'm following rules in this case. Sometimes it is smarter to commit the error than avoid it. It is only in the perspective of an aristocratic perspective of human thinking that we can disregard their eco-cognitive character, where instead the military intelligence is at play. They are not necessarily errors of reason, they are not universal. Okay. Military intelligence is a word that I have taken from René Thom. Do you know who is René Thom? A mathematician, author of the catastrophe theory. He uses this phrase moral frameworks, but it is also a violent counter. We will come back to these aspects on Wednesday. Here, they were introduced to remember to you that abduction is performed in many cases thanks to propositional language and is making hypotheses that work also in the field of morality and in the field of adversarial reasoning and in the potentiality of generating violent aspects. So now we have to come back to the problem of eco-cognitive aspects. That is in the title, and this is the subtitle of the presentation. Do you remember? Questions about the last things to clarify? Okay.
It is near the time.
About abduction, you can find more details about this aspect and also some logical to scientific understanding because of things are related to the cognitive resources of which the agent can count in the course of trying to meet the target information, time and computational capacity, to name the three most important. The agents, so also in this my model, the eco-cognitive model of abduction, are embodied and distributed cognitive systems in which the environment is important. Okay. So, cognitive openness and situatedness. And in this case, it is necessary the intervention of human beings. Where openness. Okay. The eco-cognitive openness is physically rooted in the constitutive character of human brain as an open system, permanently coupled with the environment. You cannot switch off your brain, okay, even during the sleep, okay, but you can switch off the cell phone and also computer. An open it is called open or dissipative. It is a term derived from physics system. Its activities is the continuous attempt to reach the equilibrium with the environment in which it is embedded. And this interaction can never be switched off without producing severe damage to the brain. This means that we cannot even think of the system deprived of its physical essence, which is its openness. Even from the physiological point of view, an isolated brain is considered a dead brain. Namely, if closed, it does not exist as a brain. Consequently, in the brain, contrary to the computational case, ordering is not important from the outside. That is the problem. Okay. But thanks to what I've called computational domestication of ignorant entities. But it is the outgrowth of an internal dynamical process of the system. So did you understand the meaning of these slides? It was related to the emphasis to summarize that brain is a dissipative system. So it is completely different from the physical point of view, and of course from the biological point of view, with respect to every kind of computational substrate. You know that computational substrates are not only digital computers like these, that, but also quantum computing, morphological computing. Current research in computational studies is to find more and more substrates to make them able to make computations. Okay. They also used, I was in a conference in Berkeley, they also use thermodynamical aspects to have computation. You know that there is also DNA exploited for making computation. Also, I call this computational domestication of ignorant entities. So this is not the only entity that was domesticated by Turing. They are different from brain. Okay, in this book I explain these things related to computation. Maximizing cognition. Okay. Cognitive environment situatedness in human scientific, okay, not in other kinds of cognitive activities. It is common to recur to disparate external models to make analogy or to favor the other cognitive strategies, prediction, simplification, to support the adaptive process. In this book, I contend that scientific discovery can be realized not only by the optimization, by the maximization. So science, Galileo, of course, this is the spirit of modern science, flourishes when maximizes its openness and the many possibilities, many kinds of. So that I edited recently the last year, and it is 2,000 pages. Okay. This, do you need to? Okay, who is the chair? You are the chair. I cannot play the role of the chair.
Okay, gracias. Thank you. It's very interesting. You show abduction as a kind of activity that has different elements from different kinds. So now I am thinking of abduction like something more wide than what I thought before. But my question is, if there are some limits, restrictions, how do you know something is a good abduction, and when it is a bad abduction, how, well,
Okay,
that's-
have you finished? Okay. So the answer is, in this framework, it is simple, in the sense that it depends on the contextual situation in which abductive cognition is performed. So, for instance, to explain two contextual situations. In the case of medical diagnosis, you can find some criteria that favor good creative hypothesis. And in scientific research, you can find other criteria that can grant good hypothesis. To make an example, in diagnostic medical reasoning, it is rarely that an implausible abductive grasp the truth. Maybe only in the, do you remember that TV series was Dr. What?
Dr. House.
Dr. House, yes. Dr. House was able to make irrelevant and implausible hypothesis and then to catch the truth. Okay, but it is extremely rare. But in the case of scientific cognition, it is not so rare because strange hypotheses were able to win. The famous epistemologist Paul Feyerabend, that didn't use the word abduction, that was not yet recovered in the studies of philosophy of science and cognitive science and logic, used the word counter-induction. Okay, he said that it is not induction important in science, it is counter-induction. So it is to be so strong to make interesting point. So my answer is, it depends from the contextuality, because there are many fields in which abduction are performed. For instance, in the arts, when you imagine Andy Warhol, the first the beginning of pop art, so the abduction is not related to criteria that are the ones that are working in science or in medical hypothesis, in medical diagnosis.
Okay. Javier.
Hi, I'm Javier. Welcome to Mexico. I'm sorry for my English of barrio.
It is good.
Okay.
Were you able to understand my English? Yes, because they spoken by an Italian, you know. Go ahead.
Okay. Can you speak a little bit? Un poquito of IBE, inference of best explanations. I read me llamó mucho la atención this concept. I work in definition of
Politics.
I try escape of make definitions most intento escapar de definiciones muy empíricas. I try escape from logic of Giovanni Sartori. The most or la mayoría, no sé, the majority of political scientists when make definitions of politics Lo hacen desde... Sí, lo hacen desde una perspectiva muy empírica, o sea, el método.
Well, they want to have empirical confirmation, empirical
Yes,
evidence.
Sí, eso ha hecho que a la hora de definir, bueno, ahí sí, que a la hora de hacer eso, a cualquier cosa que ven y confirman empíricamente, pues resulta que a cualquier cosa le terminan llamando política.
Okay.
It's very wide the concept. Ajá, muy polisémico, eso hace que el término sea muy polisémico. So this text que nos enviaron, este texto que nos enviaron,
Your text for today.
and ecology, bueno, para no tardarme tanto, mejor lo digo en español. Sí, solo es hablar un poco más de...
I can understand something of Spanish too.
Ok, solo hablar un poco más sobre ese concepto de IDE, sobre todo porque a la hora de que yo intento hacer mi definición, no es de que no me fije en la realidad o tratar de confirmar empíricamente, pero sí, al final mis conclusiones no son tan in the democracy environment, no escapo de ahí, porque al final y al cabo son tan empíricos que solo miran a el entorno democrático.
You look for definitions beyond of empirical perspective from politics or democracy.
Sí.
Yes.
So repeat the last part that he said.
Okay, he are looking for a definition of politics or democracy, but beyond of empirical perspective, because he thinks that an empirical perspective is so wide and trivialize the concept
Of democracy.
of politics. Politics.
Okay, so the problem of inference to the best explanation is related to two aspects. Some researchers say that abduction also involves the best explanation. Other researchers say abduction is not related to best explanation. Abduction is only related to make plausible hypotheses. Okay, then to have the best explanation, you can have, for instance, empirical confirmation. Okay, you derive from the hypothesis some consequences, and you see which one of the hypotheses is, for example, better confirmed, or in some cases eliminated, thanks to a falsification, because you have a hypothesis, you derive the consequences, you check an empirical experiment. The empirical experiment that is predicted by the hypothesis is falsified in the Popperian sense, you have to eliminate the hypothesis. Okay. If the abduction is confirmed, you can say, I am facing with the best explanation. Okay. Consider that anyway, an abductive result is not, can be the best explanation in absolute sense, because you can always, there is always the possibility to have new data. This is the non-monotonic character of abduction that eliminate also your best explanation. But in some cases you say, okay, I am satisfied. This is the best explanation. This is also a pragmatic aspect. So the criteria to reach the best explanation can be different. In empirical science, it is always something empirical, confirmation or falsification, okay. But for instance, in mathematics, you are discovering something new, you do not have empirical confirmation or falsification. You have other kinds of proofs to see what is the best result. Imre Lakatos wrote an important book on these kinds of aspects in the case of mathematics. The book called Demonstration and Confutations. Dimostrazioni e confutazioni in Italian. In your case, the case of political research on politics, I think that there will be some conflict in researchers, because some researchers will find necessary to reach a kind of the best explanation of, for instance, of democracy. When you have a theory of democracies, that is confirmed by empirical data. Okay, I don't know because I'm not an expert, but for instance, in democracy, you can derive that there are no censorship. Okay, so in this case, all our democracies of the Western world are no more democracies. If you use this empirical data, but if you use other criteria, we can say, for instance, no, okay, that I cannot imagine because I'm not expert. You can have the concept of democracy that is confirmed by theoretical aspects from the internal constitution of the concept of democracy. That is more satisfactory than another theory of democracy. Okay. For instance, in a theory of democracy, in which you say it is a democracy is in a democracy, it is necessary to have a constitution. Okay, a parliament elected by the citizen. European Union is not a democracy because European Union does not have a constitution. Okay. I'm not able to say more about that because I do not. But you know, the criteria of best explanation in this kind of human sciences research, like your case, can be in conflict. There is a conflictuality, I think, as you said. What was I able to explain? Okay.
We have 3 more participations at the moment: Alejandro, Jesus, and Alicia. But the other audience can question if you want in Spanish.
Okay. I do not think that I am so aggressive with the European Union. If in your concept of democracy, it is necessary to be a democracy only to have a parliament, the European Union is a democracy. But if it is also necessary to have a constitution, it is not a democracy. We are very perplexed in Europe about European Union because lack of constitution. Okay, is this an empirical criterion or a theoretical or regarding the concept of democracy? Okay, I'm sorry.
In the first part, you present abduction as the fallacy of the affirmation of consequence. And in the ecological point of view, that fallacy is not more a fallacy, it's like an fruitful form of reasoning, but the affirmation of consequence is not the only form of present abduction. So the other forms of present abduction, what is abduction in other forms of points of view? Well, what does ecological point of view says about that? Because as a fallacy, it's not a fallacy. But in the other presentation, in other forms of abduction, what does the ecological point of view say about that?
Okay, so my answer is abduction is a fallacy only if seen in the perspective of classical logic. Because if you adopt a non-classical logic, you can have a deductive model of abductive reasoning. All non-monotonic logics are deductive models of abductive reasonings, okay? So this is important because in that case, you have a logical model and abduction is no more a fallacy because can be illustrated thanks to a logical models. There are many possibilities. Many are also interested. Some of them were also used in the first era of artificial intelligence, before the deep learning era, that was used to build programs regarding, for instance, diagnostic reasoning in medicine. Okay, the eco-cognitive aspects regarding these logical models is not influent, okay? Because you have a model that is being a logical model, something idealized, abstract, that works, so to say, perfect, between brackets, okay? Ideal, good. That is in a kind of eco-cognitive immunization, as Aristotle said, okay? When I adopt the eco-cognitive model of abduction, it is because I see abduction from a wider perspective, okay? More cognitive, philosophical, psychological, and not only logical, because, as I said, abduction, fortunately, is a interdisciplinary concept that regards many disciplines, and so you can see abductive reasoning from many perspectives. My perspective is a perspective that is wider and that illustrates abduction in taking advantage of various contextual factors. But if you adopt the logical model of abduction, of course, abduction is no more a fallacy. When John Woods says that it is a fallacy, it is because he sees abduction still in the light of classical logic, okay? And he takes advantage of this image to say, okay, it is a fallacy, but without this kind of reasoning, human beings will be all dead because they use continually fallacious reasoning, okay? But consider that abduction, as I just said, is akin to truth, okay? But this doesn't mean that you can make bad hypotheses. Imagine physicians, they can make bad hypotheses. There are also a lot of trials against physicians because the people pretend to have, do not know that diagnostic reasoning is provisional, you know. Okay, this is my answer. So the eco-cognitive aspect does not regard the logical model of abduction, because in this case, the models are deductive. And so abduction in this case, because you are inside the non-classical logic, you have a logical model, and so it's no more a fallacy. So in this case, and this is an obvious conclusion, a logical model of abduction is one of the ways of re-evaluating abductive reasoning, okay, giving ideal and abstract models. But the classical logic is still always a fallacy.
Okay. Thank you, Jesus.
Okay, great seminar. Thank you very much. There are points that I find very interesting, and I see a close relationship between first inferential practice and echo model, right? Right. So first include feeling, image, conception, and other representations to make inferential practice, right? Even mathematical inference. And so I want to use this opportunity for us you how you put together all of these aspects when you talking about echo model, above all, because from your point of view, abduction preserve ignorance or extend truth. Yes. So what is that? It's not clear. It's not clear that expressions for me. Centrally, what is the nature of the abductive inferential practice you advocate?
Could we repeat the last sentence?
Yeah, I don't know what does preserve ignorance or extend truth mean. Yeah, and what is the nature of the abductive inferential practice you advocate
Okay.
about that?
Okay.
About both cases.
Okay. In the case of eco-cognitive model of abduction, I also used as the defense of Aristotle. Okay. In the case of ignorance preserving character of abduction, I have to refer to the ideas of the so-called GW model of abduction, Gabay-Woods. They say that abduction is always an ignorance preserving kind of reasoning. Why? As we know, abduction is a kind of reasoning as non-monotonic logic, for instance, teach us that is based always on incomplete information. Okay, so we can agree with the Dove, Gabay and Woods that okay, you have reached, for instance, the best explanation. Okay, but the best explanation does not eliminate your status of ignorance, because you, of course, you are in a better situation, but you are basically still ignorant, because abductive reasoning is always a result that can be withdrawn. Okay, but imagine, for instance, the history of science. In history of science, the best explanation, in history of physics, of astronomy, the best explanation of the solar system was the one given by Newton. Okay, and it was the best explanation for centuries until a new best explanation. That was the one of Albert Einstein in 1905, okay, when there was the theory of relativity that destroyed the previous best explanation. This means that given the fact that abductive cognition is always withdrawable, okay, so you cannot be sure. And this is a character, I wrote this in one of the books. It is a character of abductive cognition, but it is also the character of scientific cognition. Scientific cognition shares with abductive this character the fact that your hypotheses are always withdrawable, okay? And this is not the case, for instance, of metaphysics, or also of the dogmatic in religions. We in Christian religion, in Catholic religion, we have the dogma of the Trinity. Okay, this is a fixed dogma that we cannot withdraw. No? But in science, and in many abductive reasonings, you are in presence of a background of constitutive ignorance. So Gabay and Dom, they say, this is ignorance preserving. Okay, this is my answer. But maybe there was also an appendix to your question. You explain better.
Yeah, my question is about what's the difference between your proposal and the differential practice to pairs, exactly, because I can see what is the difference between both cases.
So there are many similarities because many suggestions of pairs were already in the direction of recovering the role of external factors. For instance, there is not the concept of manipulative abduction so clearly explicitly explained, but there are many examples of abductive reasoning that are performed by the exploitation of the environment. A difference is that pairs, for instance, is totally related to abductive cognition as a kind of explanatory reasoning. But in reality, in abductive reasoning, there are non-explanatory cognition, instrumental cognition, and other aspects that are not contemplated by pairs. For instance, the fact that you can make an abduction that is not explanatory, but still interesting. In mathematics, there are many abductions that are absolutely not explanatory, but they are still good abduction. So, pairs that was related to elementary geometry, and the example of mathematics in the case of geometry was related still to the role of diagram, was not completely aware of the fact that in some cases there are not explanatory kind of reasoning. In some cases there are, in other cases there are not. Okay. For instance, the diagram that I illustrated that was of Lobachevsky is a kind of explanation. You can take that as a kind of explanation of some data that you have, and you can explain with it. But in other cases, you don't have an explanation. For instance, there is a kind of mathematics in which you have a theorem, okay? You have some theorems, and you have to find the actions from which you can derive the theorems, okay? That is called reverse mathematics. It is a typical example of abductive cognition, abductive reasoning, okay? So in that case, when you reach the action doesn't explain the theorem. It is not a kind of explanatory hypothesis. It is something that is able to derive the theorem. This is my answer. Okay?
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. All good question, good complicated question. But anyway, abductive cognition, that is still not so much studied. And I remember when I wrote the first book in 2001, practically people didn't know what is abduction absolutely. Is in some sense also a complicated entity because it is, disseminated everywhere, because a typical human kind of cognition, absolutely important. I repeat, without abduction, we are not able to do anything. Okay.
Thank you. I have a problem with the concept of abduction.
Yeah.
Because the classical form of an abduction is the form of the fallacy of affirmation of the consequent, and some other ways to represent it have some way the same general form, and the form is, I have a first premise that says this hypothesis implies this fact. Second premise, this fact is true, so I conclude the hypothesis. So I conclude the hypothesis, but the hypothesis is in the premises. So I have not created anything. The process of creativity is not in abduction, it's in somewhere else.
Okay, so you are right in what you say, but it is because you stops your vision of abduction to the image given to abduction by classical logic. This is the problem.
Yes.
If you use this image of classical, you cannot find creativity because, of course, you have the first premise, the second premise, the conclusion, but you can say, okay, the fact that you have to invent the first premise, but it is because you are too conditioned by the image of given by the classical logic. But if you adopt a vision, for instance, that is more cognitive, you can see that abduction is a kind of creative reasoning, as already just said, when you invent, so to say, the first premise. Okay, and so it is because you invented the first premise that you are able to have a new abduction. The abduction that is explained by Peirce is the one of Kepler, that was in front of a lot of data, astronomic data, confusion about that were not explainable with the hypothesis of the circularity of the planets of the solar system. And in one moment, Kepler said, maybe it is an ellipse, and this is the creative first premise. So it is the ellipse that explain this data, and this is a kind of creative abduction. But if you adopt the model, the fallacious model of the classical logic, it is clearly, you cannot clearly see these aspects, these creative aspects.
Yes, what I don't understand is, okay, first, the hypothesis, if I want to make creativity part of the processes of abduction, the hypothesis is not the premises, but in the conclusion. And so, what is abduction? Okay, this is not the classical policy, but what is?
If you forget the classical logic, and this is called the syllogistic model of abduction, also in the case of Peirce, no? And adopt a more philosophical of cognitive aspect, and it is more simple to say that abduction is the creation, for instance, in the case of human beings, but also in the case of computational programs, for instance, but also in the case of mammals, because mammals are able to make hypotheses. You have a cat in your house, you can see that the cat is able to make hypotheses, okay? And you can find that abduction is a kind of being the reasoning to hypothesis, it is also the reasoning to new hypothesis that you have never seen. Okay.
We have time, the limit of the time. Somebody a little brief question. Okay. Very brief, please.
Pero no, bueno, no llegué a trasladar es sobre la duda que dijo el compañero sobre la autoexplicación. Se toma el caso de hipótesis científicas y el caso de política. Por lo menos en contraste empírico o hay pues, la Constitución. En un caso de filosofía para aplicar influencia de la explicación, ¿qué criterios se tomaría?
I will translate. So, as Javier says about politics and how to refer one explanation to other, what is the best explanation in the model of adoption for philosophical research or in philosophical research? Some criteria for what is the best explanation in one sense or another.
Okay. It is about the same question. Okay. So in the case of philosophy, it is a real particular case, okay? In my opinion, every philosophical tradition, for instance, imagine Kantian transcendentalism, okay? And then imagine Husserlian phenomenology, okay? So each of these intellectual traditions establish the criteria of what is the best philosophical hypothesis. So for Kant is to have a transcendental approach in which the critic of pure reason, there is aesthetics, analytics, in which there is imagination. In the case of Husserl, there are other criteria to judge philosophy. So in this case, you cannot, of course, you cannot compare two philosophical traditions using empirical aspects and so on. But each tradition establishes the criteria to eliminate the others. Okay, I am the best. Husserl arrives and says, I am the best. Okay, Kant arrives and says, I am the best because I am able to explain these things, and the other explain these things in a bad way. So in this case, Abduction, in philosophy, philosophy was also the discipline that invented the concept of abduction, because Aristotle was, first of all, a creative thinker, a philosopher that created a classical logic. Okay, this is my opinion. I think that it is an acceptable answer. Okay, for instance, I make an example that regards myself. I do not like, because in the case of philosophy, you can also use this kind of emotional sentences. I do not like a lot, for instance, analytic philosophy, because when I am in front of a talk, when I was in the United States, in Georgia Institute of Technology and in New York, as a visiting professor, I attended, for instance, I remember, a presentation in which there was a moral philosopher that explained the concept of duty, okay, in morality. And so the presentation was about a lot of duties, duty A, duty B, duty C, this duty, and no, he didn't say anything about the real duty, an example of duty. Okay, I do not like this kind of philosophy, but there are people that they think that is the correct philosophy. I think that it is a bit of scholastic tradition, okay? In the sense of the scholastics, of the Thomists, the one that conflicted with Galileo Galilei. But other people consider that is the good philosopher, that my approach that is more cognitive oriented, more applied, more it is not interesting, because the good philosophy, so every philosophy tradition establishes the criteria that of the best philosophical explanation. And there is also in that case, there is a conflict academic conflict, academic contrast, and so on between different traditions. Now there is also a resurgence of metaphysics, have you seen in the journals? The recovering of metaphysics, okay, for me it is of course something strange, but there are already many people that are still interested in metaphysics. This is my answer. Okay. Thank you for questions.
Thank you very much. An applause for.
Your questions.
Okay, thank you. We are very grateful to Principhia, to students of Principhia also, and students of Faculty of Philosophy, and students of the group of Louis of Logic in Research Institute of Philosophy. And thanks for the professors of the faculty and the Autonomous University of Mexico. We will see in tomorrow at 10:30. We have a series of conferences with members of the research group in Signo-Mon and also in Principhia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
Tomorrow here.
Tomorrow here. And we are grateful also with the Mexican Academy of Logic.
And on Wednesday, another presentation, more difficult. I'm kidding. I'm joking. No, because it was suggested by David.
This is not Wednesday. This
Yes, it will be in Thursday.
Thursday. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Tomorrow is a group of conferences, and Wednesday we can take a rest, and Thursday we will see you in UACM, Laboratorio Philosophical Laboratory, at 10:30 also. Thank you.